Thank you, Mr. President. You know, Mr. President, today is a bittersweet day. I'm assuming that we're going to vote along with this deal as I am, to reopen this government, to end the 35-day-old hostage crisis, and that truly is the best way to describe it. It is a bittersweet day. It's sweet because our dedicated and committed federal workers and contractors will be going back to work. It is bitter because, as I think everyone in this body that has spoken today has said, it should never have happened. And I believe, Mr. President, we have an obligation to those folks to do a better job, to make it even sweeter. Last week, Congress passed the Government Employee Fair Treatment Act of 2019, which would require that all impacted federal employees receive compensation for wages lost during the government shutdown. 35 days worth of government wages paid back. And while that is an important step, the shutdown has forced many of our federal workers to incur additional costs associated with loans, late bill payments, and other effects of missing a paycheck, paychecks that they depended on for their daily living. That's why today, along with Senators Baldwin, Cardin, Hirono, Van Hollen, Kane, Klobuchar, Shaheen, Warner, and Wyden, I've introduced the Back Pay Fairness Act. If the federal government can charge you interest for being late on your taxes, then we should be paying interest to those employees who we have borrowed their hard-earned dollars over the last 35 days. That is only fair. I am requesting in this bill that all interest be paid to the federal workers whose paychecks were withheld. The more than 5,500 federal workers in Alabama did not ask for this shutdown and should not be punished for it. It's only fair that the government pays them back with interest for putting them out of work indefinitely or forcing them to work without pay. You know, Mr. President, federal law often recognizes the importance of timely payments when it benefits the federal government. When it's the government's money, we demand that people pay on time. For example, if you don't pay your taxes on time, you can count on a notice letter from the Internal Revenue Service, at least when they're open, demanding that you pay interest on the lateness of your payments. Doesn't matter when it is. And if you go past a certain date, you get tacked on with a penalty on top of that, not just interest. Well, when the federal government owes its federal workers money, it is only reasonable, responsible, and fair that interest accrues as well. The interest rate in this legislation would be equivalent to the rate that federal agency must pay vendors when they're late. The rate known as the Treasury prompt payment rate is currently 3.625%. Again, it's only fair. As David Cox, the American Federation of Government Employees National President, said, federal workers are experiencing serious financial hardship from the shutdown. When it ends, employees will not only have to pay more than a month's worth of overdue bills, they'll also have to pay late fees and penalties, overdraft fees, and interest charges. The AFG supports the Back Pay Fairness Act with interest. Again, it is only the right thing to do. Mr. President, this shutdown that has lasted for 35 days could have been avoided. The deal that we've got today is going to reopen the government through February 15th. And then we'll go to a conference. We're going to do what the chair said to do the other day. Do what we do. I heard your remarks a few minutes ago, and I absolutely agree with them. You know, this government functions best when this body does what the founders of the Constitution said we should do. Go to regular order. Go to conference. As Senator Bennett said on the floor yesterday, our founders contemplated the fact that we're going to have disagreements. That's why we've got 100 people here. That's why there are 435. It's why there are 9 members of the Supreme Court. We're going to have disagreements. But we don't have to shut down the government over those disagreements, especially when they're political disagreements and not true substantive disagreements. This shutdown has had many costs, some that we'll never be able to quantify. Some of the losses from the president's misguided shutdown, we just can't put a cost on. And it is unfortunate that a while back in December, the President of the United States said he wanted to shut this government down. He would own this shutdown. It's unfortunate that we had 35 days, which he really didn't take that responsibility for. He still didn't do it today. But the fact is he could have avoided it. You know, we've got more than 1 million contractors. Senator Warner and others were talking about the contractors that have millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars of contracts with the federal government. Many of those in my state of Alabama. I was in Huntsville, Alabama today for the groundbreaking of a Blue Origin plant that's going to build the engines for some of the new manned spacecraft that the United States will send into orbit at a time when we were shutting down the United States government. China was putting a spacecraft on the dark side of the moon. We should be so embarrassed about that. That is one area. NASA is such an important part of Alabama and our history in this country for what we can accomplish and for what we can do good. The leaders in the country, and while we were shut down and those poor NASA employees laid off and the contractors dealing with NASA, China was jumping ahead. Well, I was so proud today when we started and we broke ground because we're going to reclaim that right. We're going to get this government open and we're going to reclaim America's role in space and technology and the human imagination that we can have that will take us beyond our borders here, beyond where we are. I've visited a number of folks in Huntsville this past weekend and heard firsthand their stories of the families, and it was heartbreaking. Members of our Coast Guard missed paychecks. For the first time in our nation's history, members of our armed forces were not paid due to a government shutdown. Coast Guard, who had boats next to the Navy in places all around the world, the Coast Guard defends this country just like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the Merchant Marines. But yet they didn't get paid because they also do other work. They do wonderful work in disaster relief. They do wonderful work around the country in rescue operations. Members of the Coast Guard missed their paychecks, and I talked to ranking members in the Coast Guard to hear their stories of how their men and women were suffering. We should be ashamed of that. Those are proud, and it's just not the Coast Guard. Yesterday, I took 6 donuts to the TSA workers in the airport in Birmingham. They were so happy. But in airport yesterday and today, those TSA agents say, thank you for doing what you can do. We're here. We are working. That is why they deserve not only their paychecks, they deserve it with interest. You know, the S&P estimated the economic cost of this shutdown at $7.1 billion. We've been arguing over 5.7, and it's already cost this country 7.1. Bloomberg says that business with contractors tied to the federal government could lose a cumulative $200 million a day. The Chamber of Commerce says that small government contractors have lost more than $2.3 billion in revenue so far. The administration has admitted that economic growth this quarter will likely be zero because of the shutdown. Payments to farmers hurt by the president's tariffs were delayed because the Department of Agriculture was closed. Now think about that. Farmers in Alabama and elsewhere got a double whammy. They got hurt because of the tariffs and the fact that China started retaliating and dried up their markets, and soybean farmers couldn't send their crops anywhere. So the president, and something I supported, even though it was a Band-Aid, decided they would give these farmers $12 billion in relief. Now, the farmers don't like bailouts. These are hardworking conservative folks that don't like bailouts. They don't want handouts. They wanted their markets back. But then, with this shutdown, half of that money couldn't be dispersed. At a time right now when those farmers were trying to get their loans in order, try to get ready for spring planting, they couldn't get any money from the Department of Agriculture. That is shameful. That is shameful. The tariff exclusion requests for businesses have not been processed, all the while that our Commerce Secretary says he just couldn't understand why people had to go to food banks. He should be ashamed. We should all be ashamed that a representative of the United States government would say such a thing when it's the administration that calls the shutdown. When the economy slows and there's less money to spend in our communities, hiring slows or stops, and wages can decline, leaving our communities even more vulnerable. And that's something that hasn't been talked about enough here. And that is, in the last 35 days, the security of the United States, not just on the southern border, but the entire United States has been at risk. Has been at risk because of this government shutdown. Cybersecurity threats from Russia, from China, from North Korea, you name it. While we may have a crisis on the border, and there are many that might dispute that it is a crisis on our southern border as opposed to chaos. Everyone understands that there's chaos. Everyone understands that our border is not as secure as it should be. And there are things that we can do to secure that border. And they should be done to secure that border. Everybody. There is no one in this body that says that they're for open borders. Last year, when the president nominated an individual who used to work with Customs and Border Patrol to be head of ICE, I asked him, in his entire career, has he ever heard of anyone in the public sector that was for open borders? He said, no, sir. It was an important question because we hear so much. We see so many allegations coming on my side of the aisle that we're all for open borders. That is not true. We want to make sure we have secure borders, but let me tell you something, folks. I also want to have a heart. I want to make sure that the United States is the moral leader of the world, and that as people coming across and they're fleeing their violence and their destruction and their families put in danger in their home countries, that we at least can try to figure out a way to help them. That we don't gas children on the border. That we don't separate families and put little children in jail. That we don't charge people $11 for a tube of toothpaste in what amounts to a private prison. That we at least can recognize that we have an element of humanity about us. That when people flee and seek refuge in the United States of America, they do so for a reason, and it's because we don't have to make this America great again. We are great. And that's why they're coming here, to get away. And we have to make sure that we understand and recognize that. And so what I want to see is that good faith effort. What I have said from the very beginning is that good faith that the president talked about today. I want to make sure, I wanted to open this government in December. We are doing today essentially what this body did on December the 19th. 35 days ago, 37 days ago. We voted unanimously to keep this government open and let people talk about the border security. Let folks talk, whether we had a threat of a national security emergency or not. That's what we do, as Senator Alexander said on the floor earlier. And I agreed with him, and I agreed with Senator Murkowski and Senator Warner and all those that spoke before me that I heard. You know, Senator Alexander said that two things went wrong in December. One, we should never have a shutdown as an option. Our federal workers should never be held hostage. Yes, people have said this is a hostage crisis because that's what it was. Those poor workers have been held hostage. And now we've got a threat again. If we don't do something in 3 weeks, it'll do it again. And the sad thing is, the really sad thing, unlike the hostage crisis as you might see on television on the news or on television and TV shows, it's the same hostages. Every time this government shuts down, it's the same hostages who are taken. And we cannot let that happen. Senator Alexander said the other thing that we didn't do what we were supposed to do. We didn't have that regular order. We saw all of the political fights play out on TV between this side or the other side, and we didn't get back to what this body does best, why I came to this body, why I'm so proud to be a part of this body, why I'm so proud to be here with Senator Patrick Leahy, who was in the U.S. Senate when I was just a staffer for Senator Heflin. To do those things for the American people and for people in my state. That's what we need to be doing. And as I listened to the President today, I appreciated the fact that he is signing this bill that I think will pass both houses. I feel confident he will. As I listen to him today, I'm thinking to myself, Mr. President, you talk about good faith, and you want people to have good faith dialogue, and they will in this body. But good faith is a two-way street. Two-way street. It is not just one side or the other, but it's a two-way street. And I worry sometimes that the President of the United States doesn't always do that. We saw last year where we had a bill for $25 billion that he decided that he didn't like, after initially said it's one of the areas he wanted to do. We saw it in December when this body came to the floor and passed unanimously a measure to keep the government open that I know would not have come to this floor by Senator McConnell had the President not indicated he would sign it and change in 24 hours. So good faith, Mr. President, is a two-way street. I'm willing to do that. I've always said that. There are a lot of people on both sides of this aisle that are ready, willing, and able to try to do the things that we need to secure our borders. But we have to have good faith coming out of the administration as well. We have to make sure that the administration takes care of those families that are trying to get away, that will look to maybe try to provide some help to those countries so that they can stem that tide of violence, to try to do some things to move these asylum seekers along and not just build walls to stop them. Let's be humanitarians as well as security agents. We can do it all. We can do that. That is not inconsistent with the American way. That is not inconsistent with all. So, Mr. President, I appreciate the time on the floor today. I would urge all of my colleagues to vote for this compromise, to open this government back. And importantly, I would urge my colleagues and in the House to let's not just give these federal workers their back pay as we've passed before. Let's do what's right. If we mean what we say, about how we appreciate our federal workers, if we mean what we say when we call and say how patriotic they are, let's do to them what the government would do otherwise. Let's give them the interest on these 35 days of back pay. Then we will truly fulfill our obligations as best we can. But importantly, let's don't let this happen again. For God's sakes, do our duty. Let's don't let this happen again in 3 weeks and go through this process once more. Let's get to work. Let's knuckle down. Let's secure the borders. But let's also do this. Let's also let this crisis within our borders that has been created over the last 35 days end forever. Let that crisis go away and never come back. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.